And I said, I just want my missionary faith back. That's all I want. Like that faith that I had when I was a missionary, I want that back. And she said, it's never coming back.
From what I can tell, yes, it's a very similar process where kind of the pain comes from the unexpected nature of it, that it was something that you took for granted, that you thought this, you implicitly believed, not explicitly, but implicitly believed that something was just going to be there for you. It was safe. It was the ground you walked on. And so when it gets yanked away, it's not just, oh, here's something that I thought was true that's not. It's like, I didn't even know this was possible.
But to fix this problem, to build the temple in a way that it can endure these sorts of earthquakes, what do they have to do? They have to close it down. They have to literally dig out the entire foundation and basically dig a hole underneath the entire temple, putting the entire thing on stilts.
All right, welcome to Cwic Show. My name is Greg Mattson, and I am your host. My guests today are Jeffrey Thayne, Nathaniel Givens, and Dan Ellsworth, all that have written or thought a lot about faith crisis or those things that might pertain directly to a faith crisis. And I want to get their opinions on what is happening currently, where there seems to be a lot more of a faith crisis, especially among youth. And there's so much information out there on the internet that people are pulling from. And there seems to be this crisis of, what do I do with this? How do I fit this into my current understanding of the gospel, of what I was taught? And I want to talk a little bit about what those causes might be, how we might work through that, and some of the thoughts that the guests have here on these topics. I want to start off, however, with discussing a couple of anchor points, I think, that will help us moving forward in this discussion. One is, and I put this out openly to all three of you, let's start with you, Jeff. What do you consider to be faith? What is faith?
Oh, that's a great question. This is my own perspective. I don't necessarily expect Nathaniel or Dan to necessarily share this perspective. But for me, I often differentiate belief, like the mental assent of a certain set of doctrines or beliefs, from what I consider to be genuine living faith, which I consider to be a fidelity, kind of a loyalty to the truths as we know it. I think that for me, one of the challenges of treating faith as this sort of mental belief, so to speak, in a set of, let's say, a set of doctrines or teachings, is that it makes matters of it kind of, how should I put it, pushes questions of faith into the quagmire of epistemology, which can sometimes get kind of mired down in it, stuck on the definitions of certainty and so forth and so on. And for me, I think about our faith in Christ as more in covenantal terms, like, for example, a marriage. I see, when it comes to my marriage to my wife, Shelby, who's absolutely wonderful, I think that that loyalty to the covenants that I have made did not require me to know everything that there is to know about her, or to have absolute certainty in some sort of abstract sense, but rather as a form of commitment that kind of rides out all the ups and downs of our relationship, so to speak. Does that make sense? And so for me, when it comes to faith in Christ, it's a sort of commitment that kind of rides out all the ups and downs and the vicissitudes of life that might cause us to question our relationship with God.
So for you, your faith would be focused more on relationship than it would be on things.
Exactly.
For example,
it's less about ideas, less about doctrines. It's more about our commitment and our covenants to the person of Christ.
Okay. Dan?
I have a few ways that I think about defining faith. One of them is sort of the biblical and the scriptural sense of trust in God. Another one is I've learned over the years what faith is not, and I learned that probably most starkly on my mission. On my mission, I had this mental model and I'm probably going to use that phrase a lot tonight, but I had a mental model that if I have enough faith, and, in the sense of like willing something, a combination of belief and will at the same time, right? That if I have enough of that combination each day, then I'm going to go out and people are just going to accept the gospel because look at all this faith I have, right? And I I crashed pretty hard from day one on my mission because I had this kind of naive view of what faith is. And I've learned, with time, I don't think on my mission that I ever really understood it in the way that I understand it now, in this sense of trust. And anyway, but I also think when we talk about the scriptural, scriptural discussions of faith, like faith as a mustard seed that brings miracles and things like that. I was telling Nathaniel once, I define it in those contexts as almost a kind of cluelessness. Like if God says, I want this to happen, you don't have these limiting factors in your brain that say, oh, that can't happen, God. Or that's just way too improbable. It's way too improbable for somebody to be healed or for me to use the gift of tongues while I'm translating something for somebody, or, you just don't have that limiting circuit that a lot of people have where things just don't seem like they can happen. And you feel kind of comfortable with what you can just see and observe, and beyond that it makes you uncomfortable to the idea that something might be possible that you can't control or observe or whatever. So I hope that makes sense.
Sure.
That is when I talk about this kind of cluelessness, I think of Joseph Smith. He had this wonderful ability to just not disagree with God. Like, okay, we're going to translate this ancient record and I'm going to do it. Okay. He didn't have this thing that said, oh, no, sorry. That's weird. He didn't have any of those kinds of mental blocks to doing things. And so as a result, God was able to say, all right, we're going to do a lot of pretty amazing things. So anyway, those are some ways that I define it.
Appreciate that. Nathaniel, what is faith to you?
So my dad and I have written a book that is coming out next year about faith. And at the beginning, we give kind of a simple definition, but maybe a little bit of an unusual one. If I can remember exactly what we said, it's faith is costly religious commitment that is sustained over time and in the face of opposition. So it has this idea of belief, but if you ask people what they believe, nobody actually knows. Like, people do a very bad job of understanding what's going on inside their own head. So if it's just about like a feeling of what do I believe, or what do I say that I believe, or what do I sense to, just like the claim of knowledge, it could be anything. People believe all kinds of weird stuff in that sense of the word. If you want to know what people really believe, you have to look at their actions, and you have to look at actions where they make a costly decision that can only be explained in terms of some belief. And that's real belief. And so that's kind of what we're getting at, is that, there is this intuitive link that people have between faith and belief, and we don't want to separate that, but it has to be a special kind of belief. And that's what we're going for, is that it's the kind of belief where you're actually making choices that are based on that belief and that wouldn't make sense without that belief, and where those choices cost you something. So that's kind of what we focus on. And I hope that kind of isn't totally separate from what Dan and Jeff have said, and it's actually, kind of related. And one other thing I just want to point out is that I don't think that if you asked me or Dan or Jeff what our definition of faith was 15 or 20 years ago, we would tell you the exact same thing that we're telling you today. And I just think that's worth pointing out because, later on in this conversation, I assume we'll be talking, more about the struggles and the trials that people have with their faith. And one thing to point out is that faith is not static. Like our understanding of the gospel is not static. It's going to grow and it's going to mature with us. So I just wanted to point out that as well.
Appreciate that. No, that sounds great. I think that fits perfectly in there. Jeff, you had something to say?
Yeah, I was going to say, I really actually really like the way Nathaniel put that. And I've heard recently the describe the distinction between confessional beliefs versus convictional beliefs. We can say we believe whatever we want, but where our real faith is, where our real trust lies, is always revealed in moments of decision, and that's where I think real faith is manifest. And it's not abstract belief; it's belief that is tested against commitment. So.
I appreciate that. I think the testing is a big part. I'm just throwing my quick 2 cents here. I really look at Alma 32 on this. And I see there, if you break it down, it looks to me exactly like the scientific method. It's the same exact thing. He even uses the term experiment. And so I go along a little bit with Dan when he says it's trust. And I think that you can't fake trust. I don't think you can ever fake trust. You know if you trust something or you don't. You can lie about it to yourself or to others, but trust is there. It's real, and it is relational, or it is based on relationships and on principles, and so there is some proof. I always believe that trust and faith actually does require proof, and it's we oftentimes think of it the other way around, and faith is something that's as we might think more of like blind, but to me, faith means there's proof. I've tested out the principles. I've tested out the relationship. I've tested out my relationship with God. There's proof of this. And that's why I can actually trust. That's why there's actually trust there. Next quick question here. You guys go a little bit quicker on this one. What is knowledge in regards to a testimony? Right. So okay, we talked about faith. Now what about testimony and knowledge, right? Up at the pulpit, I know the church is true. I know the gospel is true. What is this? And obviously it's different for everybody and they all have their own experiences, but what are we talking about here?
So if we go back to Alma 32, which I think is fantastic, obviously, there's this idea that you conduct the experiment and that gives you knowledge to a certain degree. And so I think knowledge is basically what you get at the end of a process of having kind of a cycle of faith that is strong enough for you to make a risk, take a risk, and then see kind of, I like the word evidence better than proof, but same idea. You take that risk and then you get the evidence or the proof, and it strengthens your faith, and you do that cycle again, hopefully, as long as you're following the gospel, as long as you're staying on the covenant path, you kind of go through that again and again. And if you're doing that about a specific part of the gospel, then your faith grows and grows and grows. And there comes a point where it makes sense to stop saying, I believe, and to start saying, I know. Now, I think culturally we might say I know too often, but it doesn't really matter. The point is that you say you believe, and that belief grows and grows and grows. And there comes a point where it no longer makes sense to say I believe, and it just makes sense to say I know. And I have some specific reasons to think that based on certainty that we'll get to later. But that's basically what I'm thinking, is that it's a mature faith. It's the endpoint of faith.
Appreciate that. Dan, back to you.
I'm really, whenever I bear my testimony in church, I often try to qualify it by saying there aren't very many things that I feel comfortable saying that I know. There are a lot of things I believe, a lot of things I trust. When I say I know something, it's because I've had some kind of an experience that gives me that level of confidence to where I don't doubt this thing anymore. I know it like I know that Russia exists, right? Even though I've never been there. I encourage people to think through, in philosophy, they differentiate between knowing and having a justified belief or just believing. There are a lot of things I just believe. And there are a lot of things I have a justified belief because I know like intelligent, sober-minded people who bear witness of things, and I believe them. I believe their witness testimony. But when I say I know the church is true, I'm saying there are things that the church, I don't know if promises is the right word, but teaches will happen. There are things that the church teaches will happen when people live a life of faith. And I observe those things. The gifts of the Spirit, personal revelation, peace, all of those kinds of things. I observe those. I experience some of those things. So based on that, I can say I'm a witness. I could sit on a witness stand in a courtroom and say, I know from personal experience this and that, and a few other things.
Thanks, Dan. Jeff.
Yeah, so I think in some sense, the English language is a little bit impoverished on some very crucial subjects. Like, for example, we use one word, the word love, to refer to many, many different things, right? And I think we use one word, the word no, to refer to a variety of different things. I know, like, for example, in Spanish, there's a distinction between knowing facts and knowing people, and they use different words for that. And for me, when I say, for example, that I know the church is true, what I'm saying is that I have, kind of like Dan said, I have direct encounters and experiences that I've accumulated that allow me to trust this institution as the divine, as having divine origins and purpose. Furthermore, I believe that true knowledge and testimony is really found through encounters with God. It's not that I know that God exists in some sort of abstract way, but rather I know God because I have seen his hand in my life. I've encountered him in my day-to-day experiences. I may not know what his face looks like, but I know what his voice sounds like because I have heard it. And so it's more that in Spanish, there's saber, knowledge of facts, and there's conocer, I don't know if I'm saying them right, but which is knowledge of people. And that for me, not that faith becomes knowledge through those direct encounters with the divine in the institution, in our own personal life. And that's how we acquire spiritual knowledge.
Yeah, appreciate that. Yeah, I think connoisseur, actually, if you put it more broadly, it's experience, right? It's an experience. So I've been to this place, I've seen this person, I've met this person. It's kind of an experiential knowledge in a way. I appreciate that because I think that really, as we talk about this, most people that go through a faith crisis at one point, they have faith and they have a testimony. And so I think reflecting on that idea of, well, what was my knowledge? What have I lost some of that knowledge? What has disrupted that knowledge? What has disrupted that faith are important questions as we move forward here. Now, the other thing I wanted to talk about that I think underlies faith crisis to an extent, especially today in the internet age, is worldly knowledge that comes out. And it can be about church history, it can be politics, it can be a number of different things. But my question to you is, I've raised 4 kids. They're all adults now. It was always a difficult thing. And I don't know if I always struck the right balance or not, but you have a lot of homes that may be very sheltered. And so there's very little that's opened up and talked about that would be from church history and that might be certain principles. And so you say to yourself, well, when do I open this up? When do I talk about this? Or even in Sunday school, right? What is to be brought up and what shouldn't be brought up? And do we just stick exactly to the manual as Nathaniel, your dad said about Harold B. Lee in the correlation department, where we really got strict and really went in there for a while in the 70s and put all the authority in with the apostles of far as what should be taught and centralize that. It's very open now. It's very changed since it was back then. But what's the proper balance in teaching in church, in teaching in the home, and teaching yourself, getting different books and looking at different things and understanding things? The one thing I want to bring up in this before you answer is look at the gospel topic essays that were, in hindsight, I look at it and I say, man, I wish those would have came out 20 years earlier, right? Because that could have really headed off a lot of problems, I think. And I'm sure back then they're thinking, well, the internet isn't around so much. And do we want to put something out there that isn't going to be faith promoting in a way, or that might disrupt, someone's testimony? Where do you find the balance in this? Because a lot of people that end up with a faith crisis, they come across something and they say, wait a minute, I was taught this, but now it looks like this is true. So how do we handle that?
I mean, I'll just say that I have lots of memories growing up of stacks of anti-Mormon books in my house, because my dad's first book was on the history of anti-Mormon literature. So a lot of it was like older stuff. It was like 19th century anti-Mormon stuff. There was some modern stuff too. I think there isn't one perfect answer for this, but for me, it was really helpful to be exposed to quite a lot of it. It was natural. I had questions. Also, I just spent a lot of time on the internet with the word, Mormon wasn't discouraged then. So my nickname in a lot of places was the Stormin' Mormon, which I did as a joke at first, but then deliberately to kind of attract the anti-Mormon ire. Because in a lot of forums I'd go to, there'd be Mormons who were quiet and kind of kept their religion, to themselves because they didn't like being attacked and it would be mocked. And so I was like, well, hey, I'll just be the punching bag. And so that meant I heard every crazy, weird conspiracy theory. I had one guy who was trying to convince me that his dad had the blueprints to the Washington, D.C. temple that showed there was an upside down pentagram like buried underneath it somewhere. And I think he was really serious. I couldn't even picture exactly what he was talking about. So for me, I was pretty far on the inoculation side of things, right? This idea that you've exposed people to these ideas early, it kind of takes the sting out and they're not surprised. And I'm trying to take a similar tack with my children, because they're curious, because they like ideas, because this is what we talk about. But I definitely don't think that that's the same degree of inoculation works for every parent. They kind of have to figure out where your children are at, how they react or relate to these things. And I'm a gospel doctrine teacher. I've been teaching gospel doctrine for 15, 20 years. And you kind of got to read the class and see where the class is at. You want to stretch people. I think you always want to give people a little bit more than is comfortable, but not ever more than is overwhelming. Like they should not be getting more bad information, especially in Sunday school, than they are actual edification. But I don't think that edification comes from reading from the manual necessarily. So for me, it's not like manual versus off manual. It's more, bearing testimony versus having serious conversations about, the tough topics, the best arguments that they're going to be confronted with. And you want to balance that based on, the audience that you're speaking to.
I'll just add to that. I think inoculation is really important. I think that it works wonders when you encounter this information from someone who is presenting it in the context of conviction and faith. So as an example, I teach a general psychology class to freshmen at BYU, Idaho. And so we have a unit where we talk about memory, and we talk about different, the way in which our memory is reconstructive. It's not like you're putting in a video cassette into a VCR and watching a replay of your past events, but rather how your brain is reconstructing these experiences from a bunch of partial information. Is filling in the gaps. Is what we call this pragmatic inference, where there's only a few things that are actually stored in your memory, quote unquote, even if that's even a good metaphor, and your brain is kind of fleshing out the rest. It's like putting together a puzzle, and half the pieces are missing. So your brain takes a marker and fills in what it thinks the rest of the picture looks like, so to speak. And we talk about these problems with memory, and then at the end, I'll say, and guys, guess what? This is one of the reasons why I believe Joseph Smith when he tells the story of encountering Heavenly Father and His Son, Jesus Christ, in the grove, because he told the story several times, and every time the details were a little bit different. If they weren't, I would be suspicious. The fact that they were different, the fact that each time he tells the story, we're getting different pieces of the puzzle, so to speak, tells me that is the fingerprint of what real memory looks like. And so in that way, I'm able to introduce, some of them probably already know this, some of them probably don't, but I'm able to introduce some of this information that you might find in the church, gospel topics essays, the multiple accounts of the first vision, but in a context that grows conviction. And I think that's some kind of sort of thing we can do as parents of our own children as well, or as gospel doctrine teachers, or whatever the case may be. We can share this information, but we can do so but at the same time while showcasing how this information grows our conviction rather than undermines it.
So, Greg, I would just add, I believe in inoculation too, and I always do it whenever I teach, whenever I speak. I always try to do like Nathaniel said. I want to push people a little bit out of their comfort zone each time. But I'm also a believer that there's smart inoculation and there's stupid inoculation. And I'll give an example of really, really stupid inoculation that I've heard in multiple places. And I've heard a lot of people say, actually, like, especially among former members, gosh, wouldn't it be good if in Sunday school you could say things like, hey, Job wasn't a real person? You know, and I just go, oh, that would be the stupidest thing that you could possibly say in Sunday school. So, I mean, why do some people claim Job wasn't a real person? Well, because the book of Job has some literary features to it. So some scholars who operate from a very specific paradigm think that literary features mean that you're talking about a non-existent person. But other scholars operating from a different paradigm are well aware that in the ancient world, it was very common to make sophisticated literary creations about real people, right? So I think there are a lot of people who think of inoculation as, oh, let's just kind of, gosh, give everybody this reality check. And the reality check that they give is less reflective of reality than the manual. It's stupid. And honestly, you know, I'm a little bit animated, but it just kind of drives me crazy when people propose this kind of inoculation where it's just like, oh gosh, got to tell them the truth. Job wasn't real, you know, and I just go, oh, come on, you know. I think good inoculation is to say, hey, some scholars think this way about, you know, the scriptures, and other scholars think this way. People operate from different paradigms, and you know, that's why we get different views about different things. I think we have some good examples of that emerging in the church among many of our scholars nowadays, but that used to not be the case. So anyway, I've gone on too long about that.
Thank you. Nathaniel, now you had, as you said, you had a lot of inoculation in the home, right? You had anti-Mormon literature in there, but yet getting out of the home, and I'm guessing sometime in college, you're exposed to Descartes. And all of a sudden now, this is going to throw everything off, because even with that inoculation, outside of the nest, you've now got a really deep, different worldview coming at you that disrupts what is important to you, which is certainty. How do you deal with something like that? Because that's something that would be very similar to any kind of a faith crisis.
Yeah, no. So I've never had a faith crisis specifically about religion, but you're absolutely right. I had, nobody ever taught me this. I don't know where it came from, but I had this belief that certainty was the goal and that certainty was achievable. And I just mean in general about kind of life, of everything, not just about religion, but about everything. And yeah, it was, I forget if it was before or after my mission, but I was taking the Intro to Modern Western Philosophy, and we were reading Descartes. And in full disclosure, I probably didn't read Descartes so much as pay attention to the lectures. But we went through, you know, the meditations where Descartes is kind of doubting everything. He's like, well, you have your physical senses, but they could be wrong. And, you know, there could be a demon who's, you know, tricking you, which is basically the same as, you know, you could be living in the Matrix, right? And so he went down until, you know, he gets to the famous, you know, I think, therefore I am, which was, there's nothing I can have full confidence in. There's nothing I can be certain about except my own existence, because somebody has to be having these questions. So there is somebody, and it's me, because I'm having these questions. So that's the kind of the downward slope. And then from that point, the rest of it was Descartes trying to rebuild certainty. And everybody kind of agrees with his downward slope, but nobody agrees with his upward slope, because, you know, he was like, step one, prove the existence of God, and then proceeds to go from there. So most modern philosophers are like, yeah, well, that didn't really work out so great. And I agreed. I followed all his logic every step of the way down to I think therefore I am, and then he just kind of left me there. And it was it's funny to talk about it now, but it actually really profoundly affected me because finding certainty had been really important to me. It had been like, this is why I'm in college. This is why I read these things. This is why I think, is so that I can know for certainty what's what. And if Descartes' right, I have to give up on that. Maybe certainty is possible kind of like as a miracle, divine intervention, but outside of that, there's no certainty. And so I went through the kind of process of reconstruction that people talk about a lot with faith crisis, where I had to just, and it took me weeks to even just come out of a profound depression and start deciding, okay, what's my life going to be like? How am I going to decide what to believe in and what to do if none of my belief is certain anymore? If we're just taking that off the table, and I've lived, the rest of my life in this new paradigm where certainty is impossible. I miss the old days. I can look back at myself as a teenager and things seemed brighter and clearer, primary colors, really simple beliefs. And everything since then is a little, fuzzy at the edges. It's not as bright and clear. There's caveats. So yeah, I miss it sometimes, but that's growing up. I've had to rebuild my faith in everything, my faith in reality, without certainty. And it's possible. And I don't regret going through the experience, even though it wasn't a lot of fun. And even though sometimes I get a little wistful about, what 12-year-old Nathaniel believed. He saw the world in very, very simple terms. And I miss that sometimes, but it's not accurate. This is reality. And, yeah.
Well, don't you think that really a lot of people that do go through a faith crisis, it's very similar, right? It's like at least they thought there was something that was certain, that now they see something else and now it's not.
I mean, that's my impression, right? Like I've never gone through, I've certainly had questions about, church history and theology and, often my questions are more abstract. Like, do I really believe this whole life after death thing? Like, do I really, really believe it? So I've had questions, I've had struggles, but I have to just go on the descriptions of others about what a genuine faith crisis looks like. I've never had a full-blown one, but from what, like in religion, but from what I can tell, yes, it's a very similar process where kind of the pain comes from the unexpected nature of it, that it was something that you took for granted, that you thought you implicitly believed, not explicitly, but implicitly believed that something was just going to be there for you. It was safe. It was the ground you walked on. And so when it gets yanked away, it's not just, oh, here's something that I thought was true that's not. It's like, I didn't even know this was possible. And so, yeah, I think there's a real sense of trauma and loss. And I can relate to that because it's what I went through, even if the domain was very different for my faith crisis.
Would you say that there was doubt that entered in?
I mean, that's the whole thing, right? Like Descartes wasn't exercising doubt. I think the expression my philosophy professor used was radical doubt. So yeah, it was 100% about doubt. That was the whole thing. I doubted everything. I doubted certainty, and then doubt became a part of my life. And it's never gone out. Like I live with doubt now because that's my new paradigm.
Okay, that's interesting. So you live with doubt. Dan, Jeff, do you guys live with doubt?
To some extent, yeah. I mean, I don't actively doubt things. I guess I use maybe doubt interchangeably with skepticism. I'm kind of naturally skeptical about things until I have some justification for believing them. I don't have the childlike acceptance that I did when I was a child, I guess.
Absolutely great question. I think that I would probably phrase it differently. I think that I have relinquished the need for epistemic certainty in all things, right? I think, but I don't love the word doubt just because scripturally speaking, the word doubt is typically something that we eschew rather than celebrate. But I think scripturally, when we talk about doubt, they're actually talking about this relational stance of I guess betraying our commitments and betraying our beliefs. And I don't think that's what Nathaniel is referring to here. So I think he's talking about something different than that. But as far as if we describe it as epistemic or relinquishing the need for epistemic certainty, then yeah, absolutely. in the classical sense. I would say that the search for epistemic certainty is sometimes where we get all of our hangups to begin with. I think too often people, when they are trying to pray their way out of a faith crisis, which is a good approach to doing it, by the way, I'm not denigrating that, but too often if you ask them and interrogate them on what they're looking for certainty. They're looking for a spiritual manifestation that sets aside all of their doubts, of all their uncertainty. And the truth of the matter is that's a pretty rare thing to happen, I look and I can't point to any single spiritual experience that wiped away all of my doubts. But what I can do is I can point to 100 smaller encounters, no single one of them are sufficient to dispel all my doubts. But together as a collection, they become a wellspring of experience that provides me with for the basis for my conviction. I don't know if that makes any sense. But
yeah, so I just want to mention really quick that I think Jeff is right to be careful about the language. Doubt, it can be a loaded term. And so if I say I live with uncertainty, that's really what I'm trying to say. So I'm on board with him there. And I just want to emphasize what he said. There are literally no examples of somebody going through an experience where doubt, uncertainty disappears about everything. Even the biggest conversion experiences, like Alma the Younger or Saul when Saul became Paul, did he have perfect knowledge of Jesus Christ? Yeah, I'd say he did. Did he have perfect knowledge of every aspect of the gospel? No, it doesn't look like he did. In fact, it looks a bit from his biography like he went and had to reconstruct his faith based on the Old Testament, because he was already incredibly familiar with it, but he was familiar with the Old Testament in a way that didn't lead to Christ. Then, surprise, Jesus is the Christ. Well, I've been reading this wrong my whole life. I'm going to rebuild and figure this all out. So nobody has a one moment experience where all uncertainty disappears. Even if you have an angelic visitation and uncertainty disappears on a central core topic, we still have to live with uncertainty rather than doubt.
Would you guys say then, what you're explaining here to me is, okay, so maybe all of us, definitely all of us go through times of uncertainty. Right. A lot of different things, including religion, including our faith in the gospel, in God. And some people have a harder time then, as we are maybe given a phase of needing to grow up, of where we're given uncertainty, because that's inevitable. Are some people just adapting a little bit better to that uncertainty? And so their faith crisis is shorter or non-existent to begin with, and they're more natural at adapting to uncertainty. Are they inoculated to it in some sense, and the others that really struggle with this in a faith crisis, are they unable to adapt? What brings to mind what brings to mind our discussion here is over and over the idea of faith before the miracle. Right now, we were talking about Alma 32 and getting a knowledge of something, and how the faith has to be exerted, and the study and the evidence and everything else is asking, once uncertainty is brought into the situation, is asking for certainty right away, asking for the sign before the trial, the sign before the faith.
Yeah, because, like we talked about earlier, knowledge is kind of the end of the faith journey. So when you're asking to get that certainty, which I would call knowledge, you're asking to skip the faith journey and get the reward that comes at the end. And that's not how it works. You got to go through the journey.
So, Greg, you said a phrase a minute ago that I want to come back to, and I think you said the words growing up. And I've come to believe that faith crisis, I've really come around to Thomas McConkie's model of faith crisis, that it is mainly developmental in nature. I've had hundreds and hundreds of conversations with people in faith crisis over the past few years. I went through one myself. But with the wisdom of a few years, since then, I've been able to look back and say, okay, I don't know, I used to call this a faith crisis, but now I can see that I was turning 40 And a lot of times when a guy is turning 40, we say, wait a minute, where am I in my life? Is this okay? Where is this where I should be? And you have this thing called a midlife crisis. Well, that happened to me, and my faith was part of that. And for me, so the way I define faith crisis is just a recognition that the way you have done faith up until this point is not going to work going forward. And that can entail a crisis, a process of frustration and grieving and even anger and despair sometimes, right? But that is also true of human development in general. Like when you're just developing as a human being, you go through these stages where what worked for you up until this point is not going to work going forward. And the reason why it's scary is you don't know another way to be. This is all I know. How do I do what's ahead of me? Because I don't know how, right? So when you use the phrase growing up, that resonates a lot. I think that's a very, very important phrase when we talk about faith crisis. A lot of people say the word faith crisis when what they're really experiencing is a developmental transition that's really hard, or a social crisis, or an emotional crisis, any number of other things, and we kind of lump them together and call them faith crisis.
I want to second what Dan was saying. In my psychology class, I teach a unit on developmental psychology, and we go through like Piaget's stages of cognitive development, Kohlberg's stages of moral development. I disagree with those stages, but we talk about it, and we talk about the way people physically develop over time, and there's the Erikson stages of social development. There's in developmental psychology, the expectation is that things will change. And we have this assumption that a sturdy faith never changes. And so I actually added onto this chapter that's not in the textbook that I teach from, but I said, hey guys, you can expect the way you cogitate about the world to change. You can expect your moral reasoning to evolve over time. Why shouldn't we expect your faith to mature and develop over time? And so I would love to normalize the verbiage of faith maturation rather than faith crisis. I think sometimes the vernacular we use sets people up to crisis where they don't need the crisis. If we teach people to expect their faith to mature and develop over time, almost like going through puberty as a teenager. Yep, it's going to happen to you. It happens to all of us. It's just part of life, right? Then when it happens, they don't have a crisis over it because it's something that is rather a landmark of becoming an adult, so to speak. Something to be expected, something to celebrate. Wow, your faith is maturing. This is exciting. Let's do this together, And I think by adjusting that language, we can actually, in fact, influence the emotions we experience surrounding the process. I was just watching a TED Talk by this researcher named Tiffany Watt-Smith, where she talks about the historicity of human emotion and how the language that we use to talk about emotions can actually shape the emotions that we experience. And by inventing new words to describe emotions and talking about and using those words and popularizing them in our language, we can actually increase and change the emotional landscape of our culture. And I think in some sense, we do ourselves a disservice by popularizing the vernacular of faith crisis as the primary language we're talking about these things, because it sets people up to experience a crisis. And if we change our language, I think we can change the experience.
Well, it's the same idea where faith crisis is puts you immediately into a position of reaction, right? And that which is okay. It's like, okay, I need an emergency doctor when I am in an emergency, but what can I do to prevent these things to begin with? So it sounds to me like, based on what you guys are saying, it seems to me like that needs to be part of what is taught more, instead of just, this is what I believe, I have a testimony of this, and son, daughter, you should believe the same thing, and this is why you believe this. But there should be also something added to that in church too, it seems to me, that goes over this, that says, look, our faith is always developing, and there are new uncertainties that are brought in constantly. How do we work with that? That's part of our process. Shouldn't we focus on that a little more?
Yeah, absolutely. And just as I'm listening to this conversation, I think probably the most important thing my parents did for me in terms of teaching was they modeled this for me. I don't remember them ever sitting me down and saying faith is going to change, but they talked about their beliefs and their faith with me. And implicit in those conversations over the years was seeing them change. So I watched before my eyes, my parents kind of change their views, in a growth and maturation kind of way. And so it just became an implicit assumption for me that my faith is going to change. And the thing that can be traumatic about faith change is if you're kind of in denial of the change, then you get a huge backlog of stuff. And then you hit a point where it all changes at once and you're dealing with 10 years worth of maturation. Do
you mean ignoring?
Yeah, I mean, like yeah, exactly. You're ignoring, like, because you might actually be changing subtly, but you're not paying attention to it. You're in denial. You think that you haven't changed. You think your faith is the same. And it reaches a point where you've got questions that aren't answered. You've got changes that you have made, but you haven't acknowledged. And you kind of have to deal with it all at once. And the reason you have to deal with it all at once is because you never realized you were supposed to be doing it all along. And that never happened to me because I knew, like, without ever being taught, yeah, this happens week to week, month to month, year to year, you're going to make incremental changes. And because I knew that, I dealt with those incremental changes one at a time, or like in a small volume. So I never had this huge, dam burst of like, oh my goodness, I've changed. My beliefs are different than what I thought they were. These questions haven't been answered. And it all comes to a head with a crisis. That never happened to me because I watched my parents' faith grow and change. And so I just expected mine to grow and change, and it did. And I never freaked out. So if we can kind of demonstrate that to people, I think that not only helps us have a more positive way of looking at these changes, but also we can space them out. Like, you don't have, like, maybe some of us will still go through it like a midlife crisis like Dan. Maybe that'll still happen. Like, that's totally reasonable. Like, this isn't going to make it better for everybody. This isn't going to solve everybody's faith crisis. But we could probably spread these out and treat it less like a traumatic event and more like just a natural process of incremental maturation.
So, I want to add, sorry, you can.
So I was just going to say, I recently taught elders quorum, and I tried to introduce this concept in a way that the lesson I chose was how prophets receive revelation, prophetic revelation. And what I began the class by saying, when we think of prophets receiving revelation, we're taught about that from our earliest days in the church when we're in primary. And in primary, we begin to build a mental model of what that is, how that works. And then in our youth classes, we might even just hang on to that model that we built in primary, that mental model of prophetic revelation. And then, later in life, we might learn that, gosh, the prophets consult social scientists when they are weighing an issue and praying about it. And, oh my gosh, that wasn't in my mental model that I built. And then there's this that they do. They're gathering information. They're arguing in a quorum and debating issues. Wait, none of this was in my mental model that I built. And I like the idea of teaching people that we always have these mental models, and those mental models need to be flexible enough to where we can adapt them to more and more of reality, a little more complexity. So I know I've said a lot on that, but the wrong thing to do is to say, hey, I have this simplistic model of how prophets receive revelation, and then go and enter into a period of doubt and trade that overly simplistic model for another overly simplistic model, which is that they don't receive revelation. Because if the way that they're seeking revelation doesn't fit this mental model that I built, then it's not happening. they're not receiving revelation. That's my new mental model, which is, we call that binary thinking. It's like it has to be exactly this mental model or precisely this mental model. And there are no other options on the table.
You're like full certainty on one side or the other.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Go ahead, Jeff. You had something?
Well, yeah, I was just going to add too. I really like this quote, and it kind of feeds into what you were saying, Dan. This Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. He says, "I would not give a fig for the simplicity on this side of complexity, but I would give my life for the simplicity on the other side of complexity." And I know the Hafens, Bruce Hafen, they've written a book on this subject, right? But this is what I share with my students. I say we should expect our faith to mature. We should expect that journey to walk through complexity, right? We should expect to find ourselves viewing these matters with more and greater nuance as we go along. But the end point of that journey is not skepticism. It is greater conviction, or at least it can be. And I think that so often the other side, the other narrative that's being presented to so many of the youth in the church is that once you crisis, you come out the other end as a doubter. You come out the other end as somebody who leaves the church, right? And what I try to tell students is that you should expect this maturation process to occur, and you can expect that if you stay close to the Spirit and read the Scripture and stick to the words of the prophets, as you walk this path of maturation, you're going to find yourself mired in complexities and then come out the other end with greater conviction of the restored gospel of Jesus Christ than you have now. It might be different. It might look different. It might feel different, but it will be greater.
It's a great quote by Holmes. Again, it reminds me again of that simplicity on the other side of complexity is in a way, it's the sign coming after going through the complexity, right? Same kind of idea, going through that journey first.
Hey, Greg, there's one other thing I wanted to mention really quick. You were kind of framing this as the question of, shouldn't we be teaching this stuff? And I think that can raise the question, why haven't we been in the past? So I just kind of wanted to speak in defense of the historic church and say that I do think the context has changed. And that can be a whole thing unto itself. So I'll try to be very quick. The biggest change is that we used to live in the context where it was kind of taken for granted that God exists and that Christianity is real, and you're trying to decide what church to choose. We now live in a much more secular society where the other option is much more different and much more foreign. And I think that also has a huge impact on the nature of faith growth and development and faith crisis. And so it's not so much that the church got it wrong for the last 150 years or whatever, and they should have been teaching this stuff and they weren't, but now we're smarter and we're figuring this out. I think it really is a question of the society has changed, and you can see that we're getting updated and different lessons and teachings from the general authorities. They are adjusting to this change as well. So I just kind of wanted to point that out there, because there can be a risk that even when we're kind of talking about faith crisis and why it shouldn't be so traumatic, there's an implicit assumption that, yeah, because we figured it out, which means the church historically was doing it wrong. And I don't think that would be a good assumption to make. I don't think we should look at historic leaders and say, oh, they missed this obvious fact they should have known. I think it's much more about we're adjusting to the context we're in, and we're changing the emphasis and the understanding of the gospel, not the core truths, to better integrate with the current context. Just wanted to put that out there.
No, it's a great point. I mean, we're moving at lightning speed now in our culture. So the reaction is I agree completely. I appreciate you saying that.
Greg, can I add one more thing? When I was in crisis, and again, back then I called it faith crisis. Now I might call it faith crisis, but it was kind of a midlife crisis too. Back during that time, I had dinner with some Latter-day Saints scholars, and Nathaniel's parents were there at dinner. And I talked with Nathaniel's mom. I sat right next to her. And I told her about what I was going through. And she said, well, what are you hoping for? And I said, I just want my missionary faith back. That's all I want. Like that faith that I had when I was a missionary, I want that back. And she said, it's never coming back. Period. And it sounded harsh for her to say that, but it was a gift. It was like I still remember it to this day. It was one of the best things that somebody has said to me. And what she meant was, you're a different person now. You can't go back and process reality like a 21-year-old anymore, because you're approaching 40, right? You can't. It's just this desire to go back to simplicity without moving through the complexity. It's a fool's errand. You can't do it. And that was a blessing to me. I mean, and I can say now I do have a very simple faith. I'm aware of a huge amount of complexity with all kinds of issues, but my faith is really simple. And I can tell you, I think it's stronger than it was when I was a missionary. I've never been this happy in my faith ever in my entire life.
I just wanted to add to that as well. I've actually been reading a lot about the renovations on the Salt Lake Temple, and I think it's going back to President Nelson's talk this past conference. It is a tremendous metaphor for what this maturation process looks like. They basically, apparently the engineers told the brethren that there is a 50% chance that sometime in the next 50 years, an earthquake will come in this valley strong enough to pancake the temple. And given how much time they spend in the temple, I imagine that was a bit of a concern for them, right? But to fix this problem, to build the temple in a way that it can endure these sorts of earthquakes, what do they have to do? They have to close it down. They have to literally dig out the entire foundation and basically dig a hole underneath the entire temple, putting the entire thing on stilts, and then engineer these base isolators, which are putting in underneath the temple that kind of stabilize it in an earthquake. In other words, in order to undertake this project to make this temple last sturdy enough to survive this earthquake, they have to take out the entire existing foundation, and that's a really it's hard not to describe that as a traumatic event in some respects. I don't begrudge those who experienced it as a trauma, because that is a dramatic change. They in order to do this, they've ended up tearing down a whole bunch of buildings. They're completely redoing the entire temple block, all this kind of stuff. And in the end result, it's going to look different. And the temple square is going to look different 5 years from now than it did a couple of years ago. But it's going to be a much sturdier foundation as a consequence.
Well, it was a great talk. It was a great talk, great metaphor. I want to go over some things that are listed as causes. Maybe they're the real root cause, maybe they're not, but several causes that are mentioned. I browse online and I see what people blame for maybe a faith crisis. I'm just going to run through a little list here. And I want you guys' reaction to these things, maybe to one specifically or grouped together. I don't know. But one is politics. It's interesting in the last year or so, we've had, I do a lot of politics actually on my podcast, and it's so interesting to see both sides react to things that are happening within the church. And you have people that react on one side of the political spectrum on what President Nelson does, and you have people react on the other side of the political spectrum as we're going over the Proclamation on the Family and Doctrine and Covenants, and so you've got these political views that you're dealing with on a daily or not maybe not an everyday basis, but in real time, that can divide anybody regardless of what your political bent is. And so that seems to be, as we get more and more polarized, I think, especially in the United States, is this going to cause more and more of a problem? Or are we being polarized away from gospel principles, away from what might hold our faith?
Yes. No, I mean, I won't spend a lot of time on it. I not to be too harsh, but it's basically idolatry. It's kind of well known that Americans treat politics as a religion. And for a long time, you could be a conservative American and pretty much be in harmony with the church. but it was harder if you were a liberal American, and now it's hard on both sides. So it's not going to get easier; it's going to get tougher, and it forces us to make a decision about what our true religion is. So, yeah, it's going to get tougher, but there's a positive to it, which is that it forces us to choose, and that can help.
I'll just add to that too, that I think that I've seen politics basically steal away a number of friends and even family away from the church. I've seen the way they thought they were staying still and the church was moving, when it was really them and the ground they were standing on that was moving. Their political parties, their political ideology was basically moving them away from faith and conviction, and they believed the church was moving when it really wasn't. And I think that in some ways, it's a very, very real thing. And I think it's partly because we, particularly in the United States, I have no idea how true this is elsewhere, but we have come to treat our political tribe as the core part of our identity, and in a way that overtakes our discipleship. And that's something that I've been hammering a lot on in online discourse, is urging people to recenter themselves and focus their identity instead on being disciples of the Savior, and relinquishing a little bit their grip on their political identity, because I think that strength, that gripping on the political identities too strongly carries a lot more risk today than they used to.
Here's a few others that I see out there, and that I get. I get a lot of communications actually on the podcast from people and their families or themselves and talking about these things. But another one is gender, LGBTQ, marriage, the family proclamation. The gospel topic essays is brought up a lot. I saw this, I read this, and there again, we're talking about that balance. When you bring that up and talk about it, and are you going to get sideswiped on this from reading something that is not part of your primary narrative, right? The problem of evil and adversity and suffering comes up. The CES letter, prophetic fallibility, and then a big one also is church history. It seems that anti-Mormon literature and pundits really focus a lot on the church history side. Is there anything you see out there that is beyond that is a big problem, or how do we address these things better, or what can we do to help prevent some of these as being causes for someone going through problems with faith?
Something that I would recommend. Well, I'm hoping that at some point we will incorporate some lessons in seminary and institute on honestly just how to think. Like, can you spot logical fallacies? Can you see rhetoric at work? Can you identify assumptions when you read something? Can you identify a worldview at work in something that somebody writes? The CES letter is designed to overwhelm. It's just a huge list of things, criticisms of our faith, and it's framed in a way that's very manipulative, using rhetorical tools that are very persuasive if you don't know you're being manipulated, right? Each of those issues you can work through, and you can make adjustments to your paradigm, to your mental models, right? And you can, and a lot of people have read it and been like, what's the big deal? I've already processed this stuff before. I don't see anything new or interesting here other than it's manipulative. But on that last point, worldview, I would recommend that all of your listeners, if you have not done so, go to Jeff's presentation at the FAIR conference this last August on worldview, and look at expressive individualism and some of these other worldviews. If you're not aware of how your worldview impacts how you receive information, how you value things, how you prioritize information that you receive, if you're not aware of your worldview and you can't articulate it, you are likely to get just thrashed around. right? By every wind of doctrine, by any number of false teachers who are emotionally gifted at communicating things in a way that resonates emotionally and stuff like that. Worldview is something that I really, really hope we can teach more than we do. Worldview and again, just those basic skills with critical thinking and how to identify what's going on when we're consuming information.
I just wanted to add to that as well that you had a whole list there, Greg, of various potential influences, right? That people will often say is the cause of their faith crisis or the trigger for whatever the thing led them down that road. In my experience, I have found that when my faith is sturdy, when I have a strong abiding conviction that the church is true, for example, and I encounter some of these other arguments, the contrary arguments, maybe the list of arguments listed in the CES letter, or various arguments against our teachings on marriage and family, whatever the case may be, those arguments tend to ring hollow to me, right? And I'm actually quite persuaded in some respects by Jonathan Haidt's social intuitionist theory, which basically says that our moral reasoning, we don't engage in moral reasoning and then engage in moral judgment on the basis of moral reasoning. Rather, we develop moral intuitions and then we engage in whatever moral reasoning we need to in order to justify those moral intuitions. And I think the truth of the matter is that when we pray, kneel down and pray and ask God if the church is true, the Holy Ghost isn't providing us with a litany of arguments in favor of the church's truth. The Holy Ghost is basically influencing and working on us at the level of intuition. And then from the basis of those intuitions, suddenly the arguments in favor of the restored gospel start to ring true to us. They start to become persuasive to us. Arguments against the church start to ring hollow instead. And I think what happens so often, and what people don't realize what's happening when they start to develop a faith crisis or encounter a faith crisis, it's not that those arguments that they're reading suddenly became more persuasive. It's that somehow, somewhere along the line, somebody shifted their intuitions. Maybe they started to spend too much time with friends who kept bad mouthing the church. Maybe they started investing too much time in the media that started shifting their intuitions about marriage and family. Whatever the case may be, now that their intuitions are now different, the arguments being leveled against the church now suddenly land differently than they did before. And it's startling that when they observe that happening and they don't understand why that's happening, because they're not necessarily aware of the way their intuitions have changed over time.
I'm going to be very brief and just point out that, yeah, these problems are going to persist. I think the solutions Jeff and Dan are talking about are great. The worldview apologetics is essential, but I don't think that stuff is ever really going to come from the church, because these are the problems of very online people. They are not the problem of saints across the entire world. And so I think we are expected to use our own resources. We choose to go online, be on Twitter, be on Facebook, and do all this stuff. We need to take care of ourselves, take care of our friends and family, take care of our own. There needs to be a little bit of self-service here, because the church is busy trying to grow the gospel in sub-Saharan Africa and South America and a lot of places where people aren't very online in the way, especially Americans with college degrees and white-collar jobs are.
It's a great point. Great point. All right. What's going on with the millennials and Gen Z? Because that seems to be where there is, if you believe certain books that have been written, that seems to be, well, in fact, I know it's true, that seems to be where there's a real problem right now in holding people on. In fact, it happens almost immediately now, where you have young adults that are moving out of the home or not. They're going to college, and we may get them on missions, we may not, but even when they come back, oftentimes we're having a hard time holding on to people that are from about 18 to 25 years old. There begins to be a big gap in decision-making, where are they going to be strong in the church and build a life that is going to look like maybe their parents did, or are they going to be looking for something else? What is the big change here? Is it the internet? Is it what is it more secularization in the West? What is the big change that's happening with the millennials and Gen Z?
So I'll be a little bit of a contrarian on this. I don't think the problem is really that new. I think the symptoms are different. This is a major topic in the book that me and my dad wrote. But basically, adherence, which is not the same thing as conversion, but adherence, which means being a member of a church socially, used to be the default. And so it was easy to do. And so a lot of people attended churches, ours, Baptist, Catholic, whatever, and they were not necessarily deeply converted. They weren't necessarily not converted either. They just never had to really pick. And so they just kind of were by inertia stayed in the church. And that, if you look at polls of affiliation, that makes it look like churches were super healthy. That default is no longer the case because of secularization. And because the default is no longer the case, a lot of those people who were unconverted adherents are now unconverted non-adherents. And so if you look at polls, it looks like we're getting this huge shift. All of a sudden there's a crisis. Is there really though? Like, how many people were really seriously converted 50 years ago versus just going out of inertia? I think the actual core of people who were, and I'm not trying to be elitist, but if you look through the scriptures, it looks like being a serious believing member is hard. And a minority of people do that ever. And so you had the majority who are kind of along for the ride, and now they're going along for the ride with secularization. It looks like a huge swing in the polls. Is it really that deep of a shift? I don't think so. We do need to address it. It does change the strategy. It does change the tactics. It does change the context. But I don't think it's as seismic a shift as people think it is, or as it appears just on the polls, because we measure adherence. We don't, and we can't measure conversion. And I don't think the conversion numbers are really changing that much.
Okay, yeah, again, so I just want to be clear on what you're saying then. So you're saying the drop off in numbers is simply activity. You're right. You're talking about the active numbers are dropping, but
it's more than just activity, but it's like an outside thing. It's who decides to go to church, who decides to call themselves a Christian or a Baptist or a Latter-day Saint or whatever. Those are questions of like who's joining the club. That's a superficial thing. That's just adherence. And that is not a good measure of the deeper conversion, who really has a burning, fiery testimony of Jesus Christ. And I think if we could measure that, we can't. But I think if we could, we would see that number was always small, and it's not really getting any smaller. It might even be growing.
Okay, so I'm gonna be a little contrarian with you on this and bring up one other point here. So what if, I'm just thinking about like my own kids. Even if they are not fully converted, I at least want them to go to church. Maybe they're going to get a spiritual experience. Maybe they're going to bond with somebody at the church that strengthens their testimony, and they have and increases their faith, and even a calling where they get more activity is going to, affect them and make a change. Isn't that still important?
Oh, absolutely. But like what I said is it's not as seismic as people think. That doesn't mean it's not a problem at all. I mean, you had Elder Oaks giving a whole talk in General Conference that said, folks, go to church. And he wasn't talking to Latter-day Saints. He was talking to everybody. He was telling all Christians to go to their church, not even necessarily to come to our church. He was saying, go attend. There are incredible blessings and just positive social outcomes from belonging to churches. So yeah, there is a serious problem with the lack of adherence, but I just want to have the correct level of what's really going on. I don't think it's as bad as people say, or at least it's not the kind of problem that people say, but it's certainly serious, a problem. You got Putnam and Bowling Alone, right? There's this kind of death of informal or non-governmental social institutions, and that's a problem. It's a huge problem, but it's not the same as everybody used to believe in God and now nobody believes in God. That's not happening.
I want to add to this too, that I actually completely agree with what Nathaniel's saying, that the number of the level of adherence, it might be exaggerating the problem. Evaluating on adherence might be making the problem seem worse than it really is. I will say that the backdrop, the worldview backdrop of the American church has changed. I think that is something that is happening. Whereas 30, 40 years ago, the default worldview was something that was roughly compatible with Christianity writ large. But now the default worldview is this kind of expressive individualism, and that's becoming such a default now that even within the church, you're seeing more of our youth than not taking these worldview assumptions for granted. And And so to your original question, Greg, if you ask what's happening with Generation Z, I don't know all the answers, but I can say with some certainty that whereas we are seeing an explosion of competing worldviews that are kind of being taken for granted, and that many parents in the church don't even realize are problematic as they convey these worldviews to their kids. And I think that's part of what's going on.
And that's why it is hard to hope for kids to just go to church and something good might happen if you just go, right? Because, 40, 50 years ago, you didn't have these really, really powerful, incessant voices preaching a totally different worldview, pulling them away. And now they do. And if there isn't conversion, if there isn't some encounter with God in the context of the church, then the loud voices of worldview are going to really dominate. And that's reality. I think I would much rather that my kids learn how to fast, just that, than that they check all the boxes in all the programs and whatever at church, right? I think if they can have some kind of tool set for an encounter with God, for seeking God and experiencing authentic conversion, rather than just, hey, I'm meeting my community's expectations by being here, right? I think they're much more likely to stay.
I have one more thought to add to that as well. We are essentially living in the age of Netflix. Like, modern popular entertainment is saturated with worldviews that are entirely contrary to the restored gospel of Jesus Christ. And they're not necessarily, I explained to my students the difference between informational influence, social influence, and normative social influence, right? These Netflix shows and movies, or whatever platform they may be watching these on, aren't going out and actively making a case for the opposing worldviews. All they're doing is giving you a heartwarm when the lesbian protagonist goes and finds their soulmate. And if they can give you heartwarm when, and get you to root for these things, it changes your social intuitions, and suddenly it changes how church teachings like the proclamation of the family land as you read them and experience them and encounter them. And I think that's a lot of what we're seeing with Generation Z. Is we're experiencing the effects of this gradual acculturation through our media and entertainment, and we're observing it in real time in large part. And how to fix that? I don't know. I don't think that total isolation is the answer here. I don't think that you can basically tell your kids, no, you can't watch any of the shows your friends enjoy. But I do like Nathaniel's approach, which he's shared before, which is, yeah, let's watch the show your friends enjoy. But as we do so, let's point out and examine the worldviews that are being conveyed therein. Let's inoculate, so to speak. It's an inoculation approach. Yeah, notice how this show is kind of manipulating you into changing your intuitions about marriage and gender. Yeah, let's enjoy the show, but let's notice this and let's talk about this and have these conversations on the family level. I think that's really the only way through this. I don't think that isolation is going to be the answer. And I don't think that not talking about it is the answer. I think the only way to do this is for families to actually have open conversations about these things.
Nathaniel, what are questions a doubter or an uncertain person should ask oneself if they're going through a crisis?
Well, I do think the worldview stuff is incredibly helpful if they can have that. But I'm going to be brief because I think Dan is way better at this than I am, because I don't have much to say other than, are you reading your scriptures? And that sounds really condescending, but I mean it sincerely. Reading the Book of Mormon every day, which I've taken much more seriously, has changed my life again. And I never had a faith crisis. And it's okay. Here's the one other thing I'll say is if you're having doubts, what's the replacement? I think that's what I would say. That's the most important question, because people can't just believe nothing. Not really. Nobody's actually a nihilist. So if you are doubting the faith, doubting your religion, you're doubting it in favor of something else. And the worst thing that can happen is you never realize that you are, and you just have this kind of implicit, like, utopian alternative or something. So be specific. All right, you think maybe the church isn't true. Okay, then what do you believe? Where are you going? And what are the beliefs that you're going to be embracing? And what's the evidence for this new position? Have a fair comparison of one paradigm versus another. So yeah, I'll go with that. It is make sure that you are believing something that you want to believe. And that's not about wishful thinking, because part of that wanting to believe, you want to believe things that are true. But be open-eyed. Here's the church, here's the things in favor, here are the problems, here's the alternative. Be explicit. What is the alternative? What are the things in favor of that alternative? What are the costs? What are the benefits? Do a fair comparison. Don't just be critical of the church and act as though that solves the problem, because it doesn't. You have to pick A or B. It's not just A or not A. So, yeah.
Dan, I think you're up.
I love a book that Jeff wrote recently called "Who is Truth?" And it asks us how we even think about truth, which is so important. Yes, thank you for holding that up, Greg. Do we think of truth as, and Nathaniel wrote an article for Public Square a while back that I just raved about called "Heresies That Happen to Be True." That's another one I recommend. And it's this idea, like, what are you doing? Do you think of faith as a stack of paper propositions? Like, this is true, this is false, this is true, this is false. And it's just a stack of propositions that you accept? Or do you think of it in relational terms? Are you really seeking God? Rather than, hey, I just want to have confidence in a set of abstract propositions, right? That Joseph Smith was a prophet. Okay, all right, that's in this stack of ideas, right? It's a very different endeavor to really seek God. And that has to be done on God's terms, not ours, which is why we have to account for our worldview, because if our worldview is contrary to God's, then we're going to impose our worldview on God, and that never, ever works. So I would just encourage asking those more fundamental questions. I'm 47 years old, and my reconversion has been happening since I was about 41. And going back and just rethinking, what am I doing, right? Am I seeking belonging or this propositional confidence, or am I really seeking God? Am I really seeking Christ in particular? That has changed my faith. And like I said before, I'm happier than I ever was before in my faith.
I have a couple things I can add to that as well. As Dan said, when it comes to rekindling our faith when we're in the midst of a faith crisis, what can we do? There's no substitute for seeking encounters with God. I think we need to relinquish the idea of seeking certainty with encounters. No single encounter is ever going to give you certainty, but put yourself in a position to have those encounters. In other words, like as Nathaniel said, there is no substitute for burying yourself in the Word of God every day. 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 20 minutes, whatever it takes. After that, invest yourself in your calling, because guess what? There is no better place to encounter God than in the service of your fellow beings. And then beyond that, participate in sacred ordinances, go to the temple, participate in the sacrament. These are the Sunday school answers. But ultimately, those are the contexts in which we are the most likely to encounter God in our lives. And those little encounters stacked together can turn into a burning conviction. No single one of them by themselves will do it. You need to get a growing collection of them, so to speak. And so as far as, so again, to reiterate, invest yourself in the Word of God, spend time with sacred ordinances, invest yourself in service, in your ministry, your calling, whatever the case may be. Those are the three things that I think are really going to help you rekindle what your faith, if that's your goal. Furthermore, if you wanted to go beyond that, question your worldviews. Examine whether or not you've absorbed worldviews from your culture, from your entertainment. I would say evaluate how much time you're spending on other things. You could read your scriptures for 20 minutes every day, but if you spend 2 hours a day listening to Sean Hannity or some other podcast, they're going to have a greater influence on your faith. Whatever the case, whatever source that is, make sure that you're spending the most time in the things that you want to be influencing. I think those are the really big things in my mind.
Dan, we had an extra guest there for a minute.
Yep.
Okay, so going beyond that, then, what about those that are around someone who's going through these doubts? Dan, you'd put together a slide that has two different sides of this. One is, maybe we call this the faith-based side, and one is the non-faith-based side, but they're both not good. These reactions. I'm going to read off these real quick. Here's on someone who maybe hasn't gone through this before, and they don't understand, and they're trying to react to someone going through a faith crisis. Here's one: stop sinning. I know blank is true. A short little testimony. Read your scriptures more. Doubt is sin. I mean, that's like the worst thing I could possibly think of. Okay, so doubt is sin. How about don't disappoint your loved ones? Stop reading anti-Mormon stuff. Pray more. This is just a phase. I'm happy. Why can't you be? Okay, I'm sure all of those are said sometimes, unfortunately, on one end. Now I'm going to go to the other end also, right? Here's some other ones that people might hear out there, right? Well, the way out of a faith crisis is to abandon your faith. Yep, you've been lied to your whole life. You need to listen to voices that are objective, whatever that means, right? I guess that their voice is objective. Your whole worldview is based on wishful thinking. People in every religion have the same spiritual experiences. You're another victim of a big corrupt system. Okay. So I laugh about it. I shouldn't, but because these are definitely, these are serious things, and they definitely happen. These kinds of things you hear from both sides, but I do think it's important. As I see this, the first thing I think about is, it's not just those that maybe want to pull you away and you're kind of letting go a little bit and you want to be pulled away, but it's those that are hanging on that can also cause a problem if they don't understand what you're going through and they want to be a little too, obstinate in their reaction to what's going on.
And Greg, when I say read your scriptures, some people might give that as a glib answer, like, oh, you must not be reading your scriptures. Nathaniel just made a very well-informed, mature recommendation to keep reading your scriptures. And I want to second that. And we're not saying it in a glib way. When I went through my crisis, honestly, there was a point where I just couldn't, I was like, I don't know how I could possibly be a believing member of the church again. I had come across some information I just didn't know how to process. And I was really shaken to my core, right? And as part of my process, I said, I am going to read my scriptures better than I have ever. I'm going to pray better than I have ever. I'm going to fast every week for months. I'm going to really throw myself fully into it. And then at the end of, 3 or 4 months, I'm going to take inventory and say, where am I now? And some really great things happened during that time. So when we say read your scriptures, if you're in faith crisis, we're not saying it as a glib answer. We're saying put yourself, we think in terms of planting a seed of faith in soil, right? Give yourself the best possible soil to where there's a possibility that a seed of faith can grow. And that comes from doing these things. Serve other people in the church, in your community. Do these gospel basics, and you'll have the best possible soil. There are no guarantees that you'll return to faith. I wish we could guarantee that for people, but we can't. But for heaven's sake, give yourself a chance. Try these things better than you have before with a different intensity, a different devotion than you have before.
Well, I think in the slide, contrary to what Nathaniel was saying, there's the implication that you're not studying enough, right? There's already the implication that you're not studying enough, and if you just do this, then everything's going to work out, and et cetera. I can't think of anything better, honestly, in that situation for me personally than to read the Book of Mormon constantly. I don't think there's a better suggestion than that. So. All right. So we're toward the end of this. Is there anything you would want to add to the conversation that we've had so far, or recommendations to someone who's going through uncertainty, or a family member who has someone in their family that is going through that type of uncertainty? I
would just quickly say my recommendation would be for people who don't have family members going through a faith crisis yet, to do your best to prepare. This is especially thinking of parents and children. By the time you're in faith crisis, if somebody's calling it a faith crisis, well, then it's a crisis. So good luck. You need a tourniquet, I guess, at that point. If at all possible, do what you can to model this idea of faith growth ahead of time. And also, look into worldview apologetics. Jeff's got a great presentation out on that. I think that's really important. But try to prevention. I know it's maybe not the most helpful answer, but I would emphasize, prevention if at all possible.
I'll add too that relinquish the need for immediate epistemic certainty. That's never the goal. So often, when I encounter people who are experiencing these sorts of things, they're praying, they're fasting, but they're saying, but I'm not getting the answers I'm looking for, right? But when you ask them, what are the answers you're looking for? They say, I'm looking for something that will dispel the doubts, make them go away forever. And that's not what's going to happen. I can tell you that I prayed many times to ask God if the Book of Mormon is true. There have been times when I've gotten spiritual answers to that, but not nearly as often as I might have liked, right? But I can tell you that if I change my prayers, so I'm no longer engaging in what I refer to as sign-seeking prayers, right? But rather, if I say, Heavenly Father, help me to understand the life and experiences of Alma. And then as I read the Book of Mormon, suddenly Alma's experiences start to unfold to me. And he starts to appear to me like a real person rather than some fictional person, right? And I walk away with greater conviction than I had before as a consequence. Similarly, if I ask God, is the church true, right? Well, I haven't gotten as many direct spiritual manifestations on that question as I might want, because so often when I'm asking those questions, I'm looking for signs. But if I ask God, help me to know who in my ward needs to be ministered today, and suddenly I receive revelation, and that revelation that cannot be denied. That God's hand was involved in somebody else's life and using me to bless somebody else. And I walk away from that experience with a greater conviction that the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is a divine institution designed by God to benefit his children. And so if we change our prayers so they're no longer sign-seeking prayers, but are instead prayers that in some sense presume the truthfulness of the gospel, but are asking God to help us to invest ourselves in the service, invest ourselves in the Word of God, help us to understand a little bit better the things that are going on, rather than looking for signs and heavenly manifestations, we end up walking away with a whole collection of encounters that I believe become conviction.
And I would just add, if you are going through this kind of an experience, just know that this is normal. Doesn't mean God hates you. Doesn't mean you're this fundamentally flawed individual. It's normal to make transitions in our thinking, to adjust our mental models for things. And that process often really hurts. And it especially hurts if you're changing a lot of things at the same time. And it can be overwhelming, and it can cause you to despair. Just understand that this doesn't mean that there's something wrong with you. This is a normal experience that a lot of people process. And frankly, not just in the realm of religion. There are a lot of people in secular belief systems who go through massive crises in their understanding and have to make major adjustments, and they go through, just they despair over it. But there are a lot of people who are eager to help, and we love you, and don't feel any shame about this. You have time, you can work through these things, seek God and be patient, and let this process work over time, and you'll be okay.
Appreciate all of you. Last note, just on a personal note, is I've gone through something. I wouldn't call it a full-blown faith crisis either, but I certainly went through a time of doubt, and where I questioned everything, and maybe I hit my midlife crisis a little earlier than you, Dan, but I definitely went through something like that, and I think it is a process of maturation, and it's just a process of this is what we all go through. And you know what? Thank goodness, because it's like working out. You break down your muscle, and when it comes back, it's stronger. And that's the way I feel about my faith today. And I think most of you would say the same thing. All of you probably say the same thing. Thank you so much for your time, your minds, and most importantly, your spirits in contributing to this discussion. And maybe we can do it again sometime.